No man's land, the deadliest ground on earth. The dawn over Flanders was a colorless thing, more gray than light. The air hung heavy with the weight of distant thunder, artillery fire rolling along the horizon like the slow breathing of some invisible beast. In a shallow trench, a handful of soldiers crouched in silence, waiting for the signal. Mud clung to their boots, rifles, and thoughts. Beyond the parapet stretched 200 yards of emptiness. They called it no man's land. It looked harmless in that early light, a field of mist, broken fences, and frost-tipped grass, but every man there knew it was the deadliest ground on earth. It was where courage ended and chaos began, where each heartbeat felt like borrowed time. The corporal checked his watch. 5:58, 2 minutes to 0 hour. Around him, men tightened straps, adjusted helmets, and tried not to think. Someone muttered a prayer. Another cursed softly under his breath. The corporal stared at the horizon, barely able to tell where sky ended and earth began. He thought of home, of his mother's kitchen, the sound of a kettle hissing, the smell of bread. Then a whistle blew. Everything stopped. The air, the memories, even the fear. The next moment, the world erupted into sound. Artillery screamed overhead, crashing into the German lines with the fury of gods. The ground jumped under their feet. Men climbed the ladders, boots sliding on the slick rungs, bayonets glinting in the pale light. They stumbled over the parapet and into the fog. Bullets met them instantly, invisible and precise. One man fell without a sound. Another spun backward, his helmet tumbling like a coin into the mud. The survivors pressed on, faces half hidden behind gas hoods, lungs burning from smoke. The machine guns did not stop. They never did. In minutes, the charge dissolved into chaos. Shouts became screams, orders into noise. A flare arced overhead, turning the world ghostly white. The corporal threw himself into a crater, gasping for air that tasted of metal and ash. Around him, the ground bubbled where shells had fallen seconds earlier. Mud splattered his face. Shrapnel hummed past his ear. He pressed himself flat, waiting for the barrage to move forward, for the brief, terrible silence that always followed. And when it came, he understood why the veterans said the quiet was worse than the gunfire. Because in that silence, you could hear everything else. The cries, the prayers, the dying, and beneath it all, the pulse of the earth itself, whispering that no one truly left no man's land alive. It hadn't always been this way. In the beginning, when war first swept across Europe in August 1914, soldiers still marched in neat lines, flags fluttering, bands playing marches that sounded certain of victory. They believed in speed, in bravery, in the romance of open battle. But then came the guns, vast, mechanical, inhuman. Machine guns shredded entire regiments in seconds. Cavalry charges dissolved before they reached rifle range. The thunder of modern artillery replaced the gallantry of bugles. By Christmas of that year, the armies had stopped moving altogether. Each side dug into the earth for safety, and in doing so, built their own prisons. Between them stretched a narrow wasteland that belonged to neither side, claimed only by death. The soldiers named it No Man's Land. It was the perfect name for the place the world tried to forget. Once, it had been farmland, rows of crops, fences, orchards heavy with fruit. Now it was a scar on the planet's skin. Trees were stripped bare, their trunks twisted like bones. The ground itself was alive with decay, mud thick with blood, barbed wire snarled like thorns, and the stench of rot drifting through the air. Every step outside the trench meant gambling your life against a machine built to erase you. Commanders measured courage in yards gained and lives lost. Neither side won. The earth itself did. By the spring of 1915, the war had become a stalemate carved into mud. Generals promised breakthroughs, soldiers only promised to return. In the dark hours before dawn, patrols crept into the void between the lines, crawling through fog so dense it swallowed sound. They moved past shattered helmets, frozen faces, and craters filled with water that reflected the dying moon. The silence was worse than shellfire. Every breath felt like betrayal, every movement a sin against survival. Somewhere across that emptiness, another army listened, waiting with the same dread. And in that mirrored fear, the two sides became indistinguishable. Men buried in uniforms, separated only by the width of a killing field that no one could ever truly cross. From the air, no man's land looked like another planet. Aerial photographs revealed a landscape without pattern or mercy. Webs of trenches, circles of craters, lines of barbed wire tangled like veins under diseased skin. Yet within those lines, men lived. They slept beneath the ground in dugouts cut into clay, surrounded by rats, lice, and the smell of mildew. When they climbed above the parapet, the world opened only to horror. The distance between British and German trenches was sometimes no more than 50 yards, close enough to hear coughing or a match being struck. Every sunrise promised another day of waiting, another night of shellfire. Every step outside the trench was a conversation with death that never ended. The ground itself fought back. After weeks of bombardment, the soil turned liquid. Shell holes filled with rainwater, and the corpses of men who had drowned standing up. Boots vanished in the muck, rifles jammed with slime. The air shimmered with the sour stench of rotting flesh mixed with gas residue. Steel helmets rusted within days. Even silence became a weapon. Too loud, too sudden, too empty. A soldier could lose his nerve in quiet, faster than under fire. "It's the waiting that kills you," one wrote in his diary, "not the bullets." Fear here was constant, patient, methodical, a slow erosion of the soul rather than a single blow. Every weapon was designed to harvest bodies, not win ground. Machine guns swept the field in curtains of lead. Artillery churned the same few acres into unrecognizable pulp. Gas rolled like a living mist, settling into the low spots where wounded men hid. There was no glory in it, only endurance. Stretcher-bearers crawled out at night to search the dead by touch, dragging survivors back through the wire. Sometimes they found men half-buried, still alive, their voices hoarse from calling for help that never came. The living stepped over the dead, because they had to, whispering apologies no one could hear. No man's land was not just a battlefield. It was a mirror held up to humanity, showing what happened when reason surrendered and only instinct remained. To cross no man's land was to gamble with the laws of nature. Patrols went out under the moon, crawling on elbows, their uniforms painted with soot, their hearts beating in time with the ticking of their grenades. They carried wire cutters, revolvers, and small shovels for digging in if discovered. The air smelled of rust and old rain. Each sound mattered, the creak of a belt buckle, the soft splash of a boot in a crater. Silence was the only ally. Every man knew that one careless step, one cough, could summon a machine gun that would erase the night and everyone in it. Courage here was not loud. It whispered, moved slowly, and prayed for invisibility. When patrols met in the dark, the fighting was personal and wordless. Knives, clubs, even fists, primitive tools for modern war. Men stumbled into each other and killed before realizing they shared the same fear. Afterwards, the survivors crawled back to their lines with shaking hands, sometimes dragging prisoners, sometimes nothing but memories. A patrol's success was measured not in distance gained, but in returning alive. "It's not the dead who haunt you," one soldier wrote. "It's the ones you left breathing behind." He died 2 weeks later. His body never recovered. The mud took him like it took everything else, without ceremony. The raids became nightly rituals. German stormtroopers, British tunneling companies, French scouts, all made offerings to the same god of futility. They crept across the wire to gather intelligence, cut lines, or leave mines. Sometimes they found nothing but fog and silence. Sometimes they triggered chaos that lasted for hours. The outcome never changed. By dawn, both sides had fewer men, the ground a little redder, the lines exactly where they'd started. The generals called it bravery, the soldiers called it mathematics. You added bodies until the equation stayed still. The only thing that ever advanced was the graveyard. But one winter night, for a few miraculous hours, the war forgot itself. On Christmas Eve 1914, along the Ypres front, the guns fell quiet. The snow muffled everything until even fear seemed distant. From the German trenches drifted the soft tune of Stille Nacht. Across the wire, British soldiers listened, then joined in with the first Noel. Flares rose, not for battle but for light. Men climbed out cautiously, unarmed, their breath clouds in the frozen air. They met halfway between the lines, strangers in the daylight, brothers in the dark. Cigarettes were exchanged, photographs passed hand to hand, and someone, somewhere, produced a football. They played until laughter replaced gunfire. It was the first sound of peace Europe had heard in months. At dawn, officers reappeared, furious. Orders forbade fraternization with the enemy. The soldiers obeyed, reluctantly, and returned to their trenches. When the whistles blew again, many couldn't bring themselves to fire. It's said that in some sectors, both sides deliberately aimed high for days afterward. They'd seen too much of the other side's humanity to pretend it didn't exist. The truce spread in letters, censored but unstoppable, across both empires. "I shook hands with a man who looked as tired as me," one private wrote. "He could have been my neighbor. He probably was." The generals swore it would never happen again. They kept that promise. Compassion was outlawed before the next Christmas came. By 1915, mercy had evaporated. The war became an experiment in extinction. On April 22nd, near Ypres, German soldiers opened cylinders of chlorine gas. The pale cloud rolled low across no man's land, thick as morning fog but alive with death. Birds fell from the sky. Men clutched their throats, coughing up green foam. Horses screamed until their lungs burst. The wind carried the gas into Allied trenches, and panic followed like wildfire. Some tried to outrun it. Others pressed urine-soaked cloths over their mouths to survive. Thousands died within minutes. When the cloud lifted, it left behind silence, and faces turned permanently gray. A new age of warfare had begun, one where the air itself was an enemy. Both sides used it after that. Phosgene, mustard, arsenic-based mixtures that burned the skin or drowned the lungs. Men learned to recognize poison by smell. Geraniums for phosgene, garlic for mustard. Masks became lifelines, worn even in sleep. Yet the fear persisted that one broken seal, one tear, meant suffocation. The trenches filled with the wheezing of survivors, the half-dead coughing into rags. Even rain became dangerous. Gas clung to it, turning puddles into acid. "We live in a laboratory of the damned," a French soldier wrote. He wasn't exaggerating. Science had turned the invisible into a weapon, and morality into a rumor. In no man's land, the sky no longer gave light or shelter, only warning. Winter returned, and the earth hardened again. Snow hid the dead, smoothing the battlefield into deceptive beauty. The trenches became tombs of ice. Rifles froze in men's hands. Water rations turned solid overnight. Frostbite crept slowly, first a tingle, then blackness. Toes, fingers, noses, all surrendered to cold long before courage did. Yet men still stood guard, silhouettes etched against a white horizon, knowing that behind them lay only the trench, and behind that, nothing. The stillness was maddening. Every sound carried, a whisper, a rat scurrying, the distant moan of wind through barbed wire. In that silence, the imagination became its own worst enemy. You started hearing voices, sometimes your own, sometimes the ones you'd buried yesterday. When thaw came, it was crueler than winter. The ice melted, revealing faces preserved in perfection. Dead eyes stared from the mud like mirrors. The smell returned first, heavy and undeniable. The living worked with shovels, clearing space for the new season of killing. Rats emerged in armies, fearless and sleek, feeding on everything the war had left behind. Soldiers joked they should issue them uniforms and rifles. Humor, grim and bitter, was the last defense against despair. When letters from home arrived, men read them slowly, savoring each word as if it were the last taste of a world that still made sense. Hope became a superstition, not a strategy. By 1916, generals promised that one more push would end it. At Verdun, 10 months of slaughter devoured 700,000 men. At the Somme, 60,000 British soldiers fell in a single day. The maps showed progress measured in yards, but no one could see it from the trenches. Shells turned the ground to soup. Bodies disappeared into it. Commanders spoke of gaining objectives. The men spoke of surviving breakfast. In some places, the dead were stacked as sandbags, their flesh becoming part of the fortification. Even priests stopped using words like glory. Faith wilted under the weight of statistics. "We are digging graves faster than trenches," a German officer wrote, and still the orders come. By 1917, the pattern repeated endlessly. Plan, shell, charge, die, retreat, repeat. The ground never healed, it only shifted. Craters filled with new bodies as old ones dissolved. When the rain came, helmets floated like silver lilies on pools of blood. Machine guns overheated from constant use, cooled only by canteens poured over their barrels. The men became ghosts of themselves, grey faces, hollow eyes, voices flat from exhaustion. They no longer cursed or cheered. They just moved when told. The living envied the dead for their stillness. In the end, even victory lost meaning. What difference was there between winning and surviving when both looked the same? When the guns finally stopped on November 11th, 1918, the silence fell like snow. It was not relief. It was disbelief, the kind that follows years of screaming. Men blinked at the horizon as if waiting for another shell. The ground steamed in the cold, still trembling from the final barrage. Across no man's land, white flags appeared, then figures stumbling from both sides, unarmed, dazed, their uniforms indistinguishable under mud. They looked at one another without hatred, as if waking from a nightmare too large to explain. A few even saluted. The air smelled of cordite smoke, and something older, the ghost of 4 years of fear evaporating into frost. The front lines had barely moved. Millions dead, empires broken, and the map of Europe redrawn by inches. The war that promised glory delivered only geometry. Craters and trenches etched deep enough to outlast memory. In the months that followed, soldiers went home and discovered they didn't belong there anymore. They walked city streets that felt too clean, too quiet. People spoke of peace. Veterans heard only echoes. They dreamed of the mud, woke sweating, certain the ground beneath them was shifting. Some never left the war at all. Their bodies did, but their minds stayed behind, wandering the grey expanse between the lines. Farmers returned to their fields and found iron instead of harvest. Helmets, bayonets, rusted rifles, sometimes bones. They called it la récolte du fer, the iron harvest. Even now, the land still yields it every spring, the buried souvenirs of human folly. Villages rebuilt themselves around the scars. Poppies grew where the blood had soaked deepest, fragile red against the green. Tourists would come decades later, taking photographs among the trenches, unaware that every footstep pressed down on graves without names. The earth remembered when no one else did. It held the silence the soldiers left behind and never quite released it. The poets tried to translate that silence. Wilfred Owen wrote of the old lie that dressed death in patriotism. Siegfried Sassoon turned rage into rhyme. Erich Maria Remarque, on the other side of the wire, described men reduced to a generation destroyed by the war. Their words gave voice to the mud itself, to the countless who had no graves, no stories, no markers, except the shape of the land. No man's land had swallowed them all and, in doing so, unified them. Enemies in life, indistinguishable in decay, they became the same dust, proof that death, at least, was democratic. In the years after, monuments rose like exhalations across Europe. Arches, crosses, marble angels staring at skies still grey. Their beauty couldn't hide the futility they honoured. Names filled entire walls, carved so tightly that stone itself seemed to whisper. Mothers placed flowers beneath letters they couldn't reach. Children grew up hearing stories but never the sounds. The whine of shells, the sucking mud, the last breaths under barbed wire. As time moved forward, memory shifted from voices to photographs, from photographs to silence. The soldiers who had seen no man's land grew old, their nightmares fading only when they did. Each funeral lowered another witness into the same soil that had taken their youth. By the 1970s, only a handful remained. They sat in nursing homes and village cafes, eyes clouded, hands trembling when someone mentioned the word trench. Reporters asked what they remembered most. None spoke of glory. They spoke of smell, of rain, of rats, of the faces that never left them. One veteran from Verdun said quietly, "It wasn't a place. It was the end of the world, and we lived there for years." He died a week later. The newspapers gave him 4 sentences. The war that once consumed the planet had become a footnote, its ghosts reduced to statistics. But the ground never forgot. In Flanders and the Somme, construction crews still dig up bodies every year. Bones curled around rusted rifles, fingers clutching medallions, teeth still clenched in determination. Archaeologists handle them gently, reading serial numbers like epitaphs. Sometimes the remains of 2 enemies lie side by side, their limbs intertwined by chance. They are reburied with equal ceremony under new names, known unto God. A century later, the fields still breathe when it rains, releasing the faint scent of iron and cordite, the perfume of unfinished history. At sunset, the bells of Ypres toll each evening for the missing. Tourists pause, unsure why their throats tighten. The sound rolls over the rebuilt town and out across the meadows, echoing where trenches once ran. It is not mourning exactly. It is remembrance shaped into ritual. The last witnesses are gone, but the ground itself has become their voice. And if you stand there long enough, in the hush after the bells fade, you can still hear it. The heartbeat of the world's first industrial apocalypse, slow and steady beneath the grass. The silence that once belonged to soldiers now belongs to everyone. No man's land was supposed to be temporary, a strip of horror between armies. Instead, it became eternal, a warning, a wound, and a mirror. Every generation has its own version, built not from trenches, but from fear and division. Yet the lesson remains buried just below the surface, that there is no victory waiting in the space between humanity and hate. Only emptiness, only echoes, and the endless quiet of ground that remembers what people choose to forget.